All right, hi everyone, and welcome to this Spotlight series where in this episode we'll be talking with Todd Norwood, who is the Director of Clinical Services at Omada Health. Todd, welcome.
Thanks, Ben.
Todd, tell us a little bit about your journey of how you got into digital health, kind of starting from like post-PT school.
Sure. So I think it's important to know that I've always been interested in technology. When I was in college, I was doing tech support in my dorm as a job on campus. I got into PT school and went through that, always sort of keeping my eye on technology. And then the key moment came 3, 4 years into my practice. I met a patient and we were having some really deep conversations. And one of the questions he asked me was basically, how do you use technology to make your job better? And so we would talk about this when he come in for visits, and eventually, when he was ready for discharge, I said, "Oh well, sounds like you're doing some cool stuff. Here's my card. Like, why are you so interested in PT and technology?" And he explained he was going to do a startup and around healthcare. And so, he called me back eventually, and we got together. And so that was the very early days of Fazera. Ultimately, we were acquired by Amada back in 2020, and so I've been doing this for almost 10 years if you count that start. So a little bit of just personal interest and then a little bit of good fortune to meet the right person at the right time.
Definitely. I feel like that serendipity when you meet people is it's pretty big. And I think it's timing is a pretty big deal too, right? Like if this had happened probably 10 years earlier, maybe the technologies wouldn't have supported a remote startup like Fazera. And so that kind of brings us to like where we are now, which is, a lot of AI applications getting thrown out there. Of course, it's a bit of a buzzword here. For you, like when did you get interested in AI? Because obviously when ChatGPT came out, I think that was kind of a tipping point.
Yeah, ChatGPT is certainly a game changer, I think, in terms of bringing what AI can do to the masses and really making it exciting. For me, I really think back to Siri on the iPhone as being like a big moment for me, right? Like I can talk to my phone and ask it to do something for me, right? I can ask it to schedule an appointment for me, or I can ask it to do something, make a reminder for me. It's like, whoa, this is pretty cool. Like this interaction with my device is pretty cool. And like, what else could this do? I think there's that, and I also think about pre-chat GPT is computer vision and the utilization of computer vision, of course, applied to physical therapy. You can think about quantifying things like a range of motion, for example, is a pretty important way we can use it. But it gets used in all sorts of other ways. I think there's some more exciting ways that we'll see moving into the future. And then there's the Chat GPT and the large language models, and that's some really exciting stuff. And I think we're really just getting started on how we'll get to be able to use it in medicine and physical therapy.
Agreed. We're just at the beginning. It's really exciting. Pretty overwhelming though as well, right? There's a lot of everyone's talking about it, right? It's on all the social media platforms, even in the news. And some companies are probably even using it for marketing purposes at this point, and actual purposes. So I think it's kind of everywhere, which is kind of wild. But that kind of brings me to this next point is like, where do you think is the most practical application right now for these AI tools, or at least something that excites you?
So as physical therapist, I'm thinking about documentation. I think that's a thorn in everybody's side as a PT, right? Something that we absolutely have to do, but it's something that's time consuming. And I don't think there's any PT that's going to raise their hand and say they love doing their notes at the end of the day. So when you think about AI, you think about potentially using it to transcribe information and record and create a document for you, right? We've been in medicine and PT having someone, a third party, transcribe notes for many, many years. Of course, there's always been a human on the other end doing the transcription. So thinking about using AI as a way to make our note process more efficient. Now, of course, I think there's questions with that around where is that data going? Where's the patient's data going? How is it being handled? Want to ensure that's being handled in a HIPAA compliant manner. And another piece is that who's ultimately responsible, and as the license holding provider, we as the PT are ultimately going to be responsible for the accuracy of that note. And so we can't just hand it over to AI 100%, right? We have to hand it over to AI to do that transcription, but then we have the responsibility to review it and make sure that it's accurately recorded and document everything that did happen in the visit. So I do think that can be a huge time savings. So that to me is a big thing. I think that would make a lot of PTs happy if I could spend less time documenting, but still have accurate notes that would represent the services that I provided.
Absolutely. I think, obviously documentation burden is just increasing, and it's a huge frustration, probably a big cause of burnout that we see today, and hasn't really recovered much since COVID, it seems like. So I agree with you. I think that's a really interesting application. I guess a question beyond that, like once, we figure out how to make things HIPAA compliant and handle data, um, are there any like benefits that we can't really foresee, like a almost like a second order impact of now we have all our visits digitized through this transcription, put into a note in kind of a standardized way. Are there any benefits beyond that that we might not be really focusing on yet because it's a little down the road?
Well, I think there's quality of care implications that come from that. So I think there's opportunities to automate and do chart audits at a scale that we don't think about today. And there's opportunities to identify unwarranted practice variation, particularly for conditions where we have robust clinical practice guidelines, and understand if clinicians are deviating from those in ways that's unwarranted, right? Every patient's a little bit different with patient preference and their specific case, but when we have a patient whose diagnosis really aligns with what's been studied, we should be really close to that in terms of our treatment approach. And if we're off, we can potentially flag that early in the treatment process and course correct to make sure that we're providing the best care possible. And I think the other possibility here is being able to have this huge database of data that is uniform in its nature in terms of how we've recorded the data, and be able to look at that and also essentially learn best practices for all sorts of conditions that we haven't gone out and explicitly studied, or best practices for subpopulation, right? Do we treat, let's say, a frozen shoulder different in a 50-year-old female than we do in a 50-year-old male? Or should we? And are those outcomes different? So I think there's some real opportunity there for us to aggregate the data in ways that we can't today and understand how can we adjust our practices for the patient that's in front of us to optimize their outcomes.
Yeah, it's it makes me want to talk about this for hours and kind of unpack more. I feel like we're about to open Pandora's box, so I might close it a bit. I think there's so much more to talk about here, and I think your story's really interesting, probably really interesting for others to kind of hear your journey. By the way, if you're listening to this and you want to share your journey, please reach out to us at the TechSig. Just go on the ALI TechSig website, and we'd love to get in touch. But Todd, thank you so much for joining us. And yeah, we hope to see you again.
All right, thanks for having me, Ben.
Thanks.